Good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the York Festival of Ideas. I will be chairing the session today. My name is Professor Tim Andrews. I'm the head of department in the Department of Psychology at the University of York. Right, over to today's session. So I'm delighted to welcome you to an absolutely fascinating event this evening, with not just two, but three heads talking to us about their book, Two Heads, where two neuroscientists explore how our brains work with other brains. Now, the book is written by professors and husband and wife team, Uta and Chris Frith, working with their son, Alex Frith, and the artist, Dan Locke. Two Heads is a brilliantly illustrated journey through the wonders and mysteries of the human brain, in which they explain how it's evolved to work cooperatively. So we're really excited to hear tonight from each of them and have an opportunity for a group discussion and audience questions, which you can post in the Q&A box at the bottom of the page. So before I start, just a quick introduction to each of our speakers. Uta Frith is an expert both autism and dyslexia and has been ranked as one of the most eminent research psychologists of the modern era and currently serves as the president of the British Science Association. Chris Frith, a psychologist and professor emeritus at the Wellcome Trust Centre for Neuroimaging, has been ranked among the 10 most influential brain scientists of the modern era. He's a pioneer in the use of brain imaging and was a senior member of the team that discovered enlargement of the hippocampus in brains of London taxi drivers. Now, a couple of other facts I've picked up on just about the Uta and Chris is that one of them was that they were both married in York. So it seems really appropriate that they should be delivering this talk here to the York Festival of Ideas, and also that they both hold honorary doctorates at the University of York. So another reason. Alex Frith, their son, is a publisher and writer at Usborne Publishing. I've just had a look at Usborne Publishing website and seen a selection of books that look really fascinating. So I encourage you to go and do that. Now, it's clear Alex is not a scientist, but obviously in publishing, so but is equally as successful. And so I'll let you think about whether the idea of nature versus nurture, something to ponder while you're listening to them talking. Now, unfortunately, Dan Locke, who's a Brighton-based artist and comic creator who's worked with the Art Council England, Wellcome Trust and the National Trust, is unable to be with us today. So that's really unfortunate. But those of you who've read the book will really see the impact that Dan has had on this project, looking at some of the excellent artwork. So Uta, Chris, Alex, welcome, and we're over to you for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Tim, and hello, everybody. I'm going first because I'm probably the last reason why any of you chose to sign up for this event, but that's okay. So as Tim said, my sort of day job is I write and edit children's non-fiction books. And I think, to be honest, that's a very big reason why I'm part of this project. So when my parents won a prize from an institute in Paris to talk about and write about some of the research they've been doing on cooperating brains, they decided they wanted to do it as a comic. And they asked me to sort of write the script for them because that's, I guess, my expertise. And I couldn't say no because you can't really say no to your parents, but also I didn't want to because any opportunity to kind of try doing something in comics that's different from normal is what I'm really interested in. Now, there's probably two reasons why we've done Two Heads as a graphic novel. And one is just honestly because we all like and read a lot of comics, and I certainly grew up surrounded by them. But also, there's something about the process of making comics that is inherently to do with cooperating brains. So if it starts with me writing a script about a subject that I don't actually know inside out myself, I have to kind of make sure that I'm understanding what I'm talking about so that I can communicate it correctly, as Chris and Uta would attest if it's true or not what we've written, but also to explain it to Dan, the artist, so that he understands what picture he's drawing and that he's communicating the correct ideas with the pictures as well as us with the words. And that's kind of a really fun meta layer of cooperation that we got into this book. And yes, it's also true that by doing something as a comic, you have the excuse to put pastiches of Batman into it, which is what this slide is showing here. And another sort of typical feature of comics that we didn't really try to fire our way around because we thought it would work is biographies. of classic comics that tell the life stories of people who are in them. And in this book, we do talk a bit about Chris and Uta and their life and how they met, but more, to be honest, what it is about the human brain that got them interested in it. So we go to that. And then on the next slide, you'll see something that, this is why we're a bit sad that Dan couldn't be here today. This is one of his favorite pages, where he had an excuse to render Chris and Uta as first bees and then later as fruit flies. And he's using an art style that he kind of grew up loving, which is from very, very early Disney cartoons, even before sort of Mickey Mouse was invented. And that's another thing that we can do with comics, that we can explain a science idea, but dress it up in bee and fly costumes and still communicate something hopefully interesting, but also intelligible and fully referenced in footnotes at the back of the book. So the next slide goes back to the idea that I suspect most of you watching this, whether you're watching it live with questions or whether you're going to watch it later on YouTube, are here because you're interested in the human brain, you're interested in psychology, and you want to know what it is that makes people interact with each other successfully and unsuccessfully. And if you want to know that, you want to ask people who are experts in the subject, and that's very much not me, that's Uta and Chris. And again, a theme within this book is about how important reputation is. So our brains are programmed, for want of a better word, to identify which people we can trust and what things we can trust them to saying. And then if we want to sort of share our ideas with other people, we think, well, I'm saying it because I heard so-and-so say it and I trust them, so you should trust me too. And that's a kind of a classic part of human interaction. And then getting back to the comics origins, we've got another slide here shows a page from a very old comic book from the 1850s or 60s, I can't remember which, by a German artist called Wilhelm Busch, who's certainly someone that I grew up reading as a child, but has been in households around the world for, coming up for close to 200 years. And he wrote lots of different stories about animals and humans, but perhaps his most famous work is Max and Moritz, about two naughty boys who play tricks on people. And these kind of comics are still, it's what we read in Beano today. And the interesting thing here is that Uta was working with two colleagues in the early 80s, and they sort of chanced upon this page. Well, they didn't chance upon it, they all knew it from their childhood, but they remembered it. And how the way that this one page of a comic works is that you, the reader, have to be able to understand what the two boys at the top of the page are thinking about, and also what they think the lady at the bottom of the page is thinking about, and even what's going on in the mind of the dog who's in the middle. So there's several layers of different brains understanding and thinking about each other, and we, the reader, instinctively knowing that these characters can know what is or isn't in the minds of those other people. And that's another thing that we explore in the book, and that just speaks to the kind of the range of what social interaction and neuroscience of cooperation is all about. So I will just move to the next slide to say that what we've chosen to focus on for this short talk today is just 4 of the ideas that are in this book, which if any of you have seen it already, you'll know that it's well over 300 pages long. So there's a lot of ideas in it, we hope. And hopefully, even if you're already in the world of neuroscience, there'll be things in it that you didn't know before. And certainly there might be stories behind how we made ththese discoveries that you didn't know. So I'm going to hand over to Uta and Chris to answer as best as they can. Brackets, this is not very well, because the secret for psychology is that no one really knows anything. And they will tell you what we do know about these 4 questions.
Thanks very much. The first question we want to just give you a flavor of is, how do people behave when they're working together? Do they actually trust each other? And very fortunately, there is a tool, there is a so-called trust game that's been developed by Joyce Berg. Now, in this game, you need to decide whether to trust your partner sufficiently to give them some of your money with the hope of getting back returns. And if you are player 1 and you give money away, this advertises that you are a trusting person, but you take the risk that your partner, player 2, simply takes all the money and runs. Because of this particular risk, the rational economist's reasoning is that you keep all the money for yourself, especially if you are player 2. Now, just on the side, you will see that our graphic novel has actually references. And so it suggests that we don't just want to take our word for it, but to be able to check on the evidence. Now, what happened in this trust game? Player one in all the different player ones, this repeated experiment, the player twos in the bottom row. So the economists were proved wrong. The vast majority of player ones give away more than half their money. And most of the player twos give even more of their money back. So it seems that it's more important for the players to advertise that they're trustworthy than to keep the swag. Why do they do this? Now we can go back to Adam Smith, the Scottish Enlightenment thinker, also known as the father of economics. Well, he claimed that nature endowed us with a craving. This is the craving for a good reputation. He believed, in fact, that humans value a good reputation even more than money. Being generous gives you a good reputation.
But are people instinctively kind, or are we just selfishly seeking for this good reputation? This has been explored further with the game that we already heard about, and where people try to look at what happens in these games. How do you play when you act intuitively? And the way this was achieved is that they didn't give people time to deliberate, or they gave them something else to think about while they were making their choice, known to psychologists as a cognitive load. And these studies show that most people are more generous when they don't think about it too much. People are instinctively kind. But this is a perhaps very artificial lab situation. What happens if we're actually in danger? I'm sure you remember that Hobbes believed that we are all naturally competitive, and that particularly in danger, we will fall back into brutishness and misery. But this is not actually what happens. For example, numerous testimonies about behavior after the 7th of July bomb attack in the London Underground mention the help that the victims gave to each other. Selfish behavior was rarely reported. What happens if we're simply scared? We can't really have bomb attacks in a controlled situation, but this is our colleagues in France looked at what happened in a haunted house ride. What did the people do when they were scared? And what they show is that people don't actually push each other away when they're in danger, they cling to each other. And indeed, in real life, terrible circumstances, in disasters, people are more likely to be killed by compassion than by competition. They often tarry to help friends or family members.
So here is the next question. Is it better to surround yourself with people who are similar to yourself or different? Now, it does seem that we have a natural inclination to choose people who are like us, people we are familiar with, and hence we feel we can trust. But is this always a good idea? No, it's not. It's the sort of thing that leads to nepotism, and it tempts us into showing this infamous bias for our in-group. In fact, we know from a lot of evidence that groups all benefit from having different kinds of people. Here is a difference that has to do with whether you are basically an explorer or an exploiter. So if you know where the food is, you can exploit this knowledge. But then if there is better food elsewhere, or if the food runs out, what do? You need to explore to find the other source. And we benefit from variation, individual differences in this dimension. In fact, all social animals are wise to this. They all need both explorers and exploiters. And that's true for the bees in particular. So 4 in 100 bees, for example, are dedicated scouts. They are explorers. They go to find out where the best next nest site is, where the really good nectar is to be had. And the exploiters will follow. Now, science in particular thrives on diversity of an approach. A mixture of explorers and exploiters is, of course, especially important in the case of advances in science. Explorers find new areas of research, they can find a way out of a dead end, they can come up with novel ideas. But exploiters are the ones that make sure that a good idea is not abandoned prematurely. In addition, they synthesize what is known, and they can therefore identify what is not known and also what has been actually a mistake. It means exploiters can push against ideas that turn out to be wrong. It's a very critical part of how science is done. In a good mix of people in a group working together, they're not just explorers and exploiters, of course. There are scientists and non-scientists. There are social addicts, and there are loners. They're young, they're old, and so on. We have to sort out diverse groups to work with. And you need an overlap of many different qualities. So, for example, in our area, studying what makes us social, you need psychologists, brain imagers, linguists, anthropologists, sociologists, political scientists, and so on. So diversity is important. It has so many benefits. We can't do without it. But we have to admit it also has problems. And one of the major problems is that we just find it much easier to talk to people who are like us, who come from the same background. When we work in diverse groups, we need to find that common ground. We need to slow down to achieve a common language, to understand each other. And in fact, slowing down in itself can be a very good thing. I've been campaigning for slow science, for example, because we are at the moment in a kind of strange rat race where it's really going on. There's a lot of pressure to publish. It's really publish or perish. And in fact, we should slow down to avoid the pitfalls of this culture.
But what about, is it really the case that two heads are better than one? Do people do better if they work together in pairs? Here's an experiment by Bahadur Barami, which he calls social psychophysics, where you have two people instead of one. They're looking at separate screens and they have to say, are there more green, blue, or yellow dots? And it's a difficult task, so sometimes they will disagree. And when that happened, they had to discuss the problem with each other and come up with a joint answer. And it was consistently found that with this task and others, the answer of the two people working together was actually better than either one on their own, and it was better than the best one working on their own. So how was this possible? The answer is confidence is the key. So these two people we see here spent hours and hours going through what people actually said during their discussion. And the ones that were most successful always talked about confidence. And they came up with a scale for describing different levels of confidence, from the highest confidence to the lowest confidence. And this enables them to do better than the two people separately. Because of course, when you do tasks like this, your attention will fluctuate from trial to trial. Sometimes you won't have been looking quite correctly. And if you can know this and report it to your partner, you can, because you're less confident than they are, by choosing the answer of the more confident person on each trial, you can eliminate these dropouts, as it were, and get a better answer. Now, interestingly, the same thing happens in the bees. When they need to find a new nesting site, the scouts go out, they find a site, they come back, and they do their waggle dance. The orientation of the dance tells you where the nesting site is, and the length of the dance tells you how good the site is, which is equivalent in this case to confidence. And the longer dances attract more scouts, and eventually by this positive feedback loop, the best site is determined by this confidence sharing procedure. The same thing happens in fish. That's how the scroll of fish can follow a very small signal in the water. So many animals benefit from working together, but of course humans use this strategy in a completely flexible way. They can apply it to novel problems, and they can develop novel ways of communicating their confidence. However, there are situations when cooperation goes wrong, and this is particularly when we think too much. So thinking about thinking is sometimes called metacognition, and this could mean thinking about my own thinking, and you can see on the left side how you can get into a loop where you think I'm thinking about metacognition, and now I'm thinking about metacognition, and it goes on, and you get stuck. When you can also use it to think about other people's thinking, and this leads to a similar type of recursion. So when playing chess, for example, you might think, what move is she going to make? What move does she think I'm going to make? What move does she think I think she is going to make? And so on. Now, interestingly, this is what amateurs do, not what good chess players do. But in certain situations, the desire to cooperate and think about the other person can lead to a very unhappy outcome. And we're thinking about the story by O. Henry called The Gift of the Magi, which goes like this. James and Della are happy, but poor young people who want to buy each other wonderful Christmas gifts. And James knows that Della's proudest possession is her long flowing golden hair, so he decides to buy her a silver comb. And Della knows how much James values his pocket watch. She decides to buy a matching gold chain. The only trouble is that in order to afford the chain, Della cuts off and sells her hair, while James pawns his watch. So they finish up on Christmas morning exchanging gifts that are now useless. This is an example of overthinking, thinking about what the other person do and you thinking about what the other person will do, leading to this impasse, which is a bad thing. So it's arguably it's easier in cooperative situation if only one person thinks about the other. And this has been demonstrated by our friends in Paris with Jean Donizeau, showing that in cooperative situations, it's little recursion and differences between the people is a good thing. And it's only in competitive situations where recursion can give you an advantage.
So let's talk more about trust and reputation as our last question. And particularly, we are very interested in the in social media, in what happens on the internet. How do we manage? And it is the case that many of us have become quite addicted to social media. It's an area where research is definitely needed. Now, using social media has both rewarding and punishing effects. I rely a lot on Twitter to get information about what's happening to my younger colleagues, and also about papers that I would not have had time to find myself. But the question I face all the time is whether I can rely on this information on Twitter. Would I be better off scouring contents of pages of journals that are relevant to me? Well, social media in theory are a great time saver and a simple and very direct source of information. But the information is only as reliable as the people posting it on the social media. It's very similar to gossip, and gossip is also something that has its benefit and its disadvantages, but it's something that has always been part of human interaction, something we enjoy a lot. You could even say we are addicted to. Now, in the age of the internet, this kind of gossip has really proliferated in a huge way. And at the same time, there has been a huge rise in reputation management. Now we have ratings for services, for restaurants, for purchases on eBay, and so on. And most of this is done anonymously. So anyone can hide themselves under different accounts can take on different persona, can give high ratings to themselves and low ratings to competitors. And the same person can give the impression with different accounts that information is coming from different and independent sources when in fact it's only one. Now, of course, we have new rules and laws even that are being created to overcome the problem of gaming reputations through adopting anonymity, creating false identities and indeed false photographs. So learning about other people's reputation, maintaining one's own reputation is harder than ever. And I think we need to own up. Getting a good reputation is a costly business. And you might well ask, what can we do to get a genuinely good reputation? How do we know whether other people have a genuinely good reputation? And we think it's about doing good things that others will notice and talk about. It's about being consistent. This means consistently good, but it's not so simple. There is a strange twist because you have to be careful not to advertise your honesty and your goodness too blatantly. It can earn you the anger of those people who are shown up as ungenerous, as not trustworthy. They don't like to be shown up, and good deeds sometimes are punished. So in our social lives, we are always treading a thin line between comedy and tragedy.
We are all dependent on each other.
But working together is hard.
We're never entirely in control.
And we need more research. But
we would say
that,
wouldn't we?
It's now time for your questions.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Chris, Uta and Alex, for wonderful presentation. We've already got some questions in. Just to remind you, if you'd like to ask a question, then please go to the Q&A button and just type in. So we go straight to the first question, which really comes back to the idea of reputation. A very nice question from Fee here, who asked, what happens to our brains and the way we behave if we feel our reputation is already damaged or reduced? So I guess they're asking, he's asking whether, you know, if your reputation is down, how do you get it back? Over to you, Uta and Chris.
So it's a very interesting question that I think experimentally has not been tackled, as far as I know.
Yes, I mean, there's quite a lot of work on responding to the reputations of other people. So, for example, we learn about people's reputations in, for example, the trust game we talked about. If they give back more money than you expect, then their reputation goes up. If they give back less money than you expect, their reputation goes down. What is interesting is that if you're told in advance, this is a jolly nice person, the brain stops bothering to follow these signals. So that's why gossip is such a powerful thing. But we know much less about what happens when you're thinking about your own reputation.
How do you repair it? I think there is a related area of research that has to do with what's called forgiveness.
Yeah.
You know, you have a kind of situations where the rule you can extract is tit for tat. You know, you do something bad to me, I do something bad to you. You do something good to me, I will do something good to you. Just sort of straightforward. Really doesn't leave any slack.
Yeah.
And therefore, if there is one perceived bad thing, that's the end of that little cooperation. But in fact, that
even though it was actually
bad thing might have been
noise, or
might have been an error. It might not have been intentional. So another strategy, which is actually turns out to be much better, is tit for tat +1. That is giving the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
And then in that sense, you can see that in time, you indicate that you allow that one bad event, damaging event, to have possibly been an error, to have possibly non-intentional, you allow the other person to increase in trustworthiness.
Which is a very long way of saying we don't know. Yeah.
But there is indeed, interestingly, in that situation, there are actually brain imaging studies that tell you that there are changes in the brain occurring according to whether you trust or do not trust somebody, and whether you are being trusted or not. And sometimes
there is actually a related thing to this in the book that, unless I'm getting completely off track, also partly answers as one of the questions that came later is about why we're so obsessed with reputation, and it's to do with ostracism. So one feature of reputation is, do people think of you as someone who kind of belongs? Do you fit into our group? And they have done quite a lot of studies to show that when you play really quite unpleasant games with people in which you kind of make them feel as if they've been ostracized, it has a massive and immediate effect on them. And what they try and do is desperately copy the other people as much and as closely detailed as possible, in the hope that copying them will kind of allow them to be welcomed back into the group. And I guess that's not completely the same as reputation, but it is related, so that you have a reputation of being not just a good person or good at something, but being the sort of person that we like to hang around with, I guess.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
It seems that that's very built into our system, from what I've read when doing this book, is that we hate being shunned people a lot, so we try hard not to be.
Yeah, there's a related thing about these in-groups and out-groups, that is that we really despise the out-group. You know, they're just not as good as we are morally. So it's quite disconcerting if you find a member of the out-group being morally superior, perhaps, to members of your own in-group. And that can change your own attitude quite a bit. But maybe we have more questions.
Great. Well, it seems like thanks for that question, Fee. Seems like there's more questions to be answered here as well in that area. So that's a great question to start off with. Thank you very much. We've got another question, an anonymous question, but a very good one, which is about chess players. And the question is, I would love to know how good chess players think, if not in the distinct steps as you outlined. So if we're not thinking about what other people are thinking, how do good chess players play the game, Chris? What do you think?
We're not chess experts. But from my understanding of it, the real professional level chess players spend most of their time studying chess games that people have played in the past. And they see, if the board looks like this and I move one piece here or one piece there, which previous game does that most resemble, and how did that game end up playing out? And I think that seems to be that kind of pattern learning is more the secret to winning chess.
They look at the board and say, this bit of the board is good and this bit is bad, and that all seems to be a strange pattern detecting system, not thinking about what the other person will do at all.
But I would say, don't trust our reputation on that answer, because none of us play chess.
Okay, but yes, fantastic. Good answer to that top tip. So don't overthink things, but just look up books and things like that. That's good. Okay, so Marcella's got a question here, which is, can we say that the confidence that we acquire when we are working with two brains is a consequence of the lack of our own confidence? Is it something like that we need one another to confirm or assure what we did? Is that important for working together?
Well, yes, one thing that is very important is that when you're working with somebody and you're telling each other how confident you have that the way you talk about it has to be matched. And you would have a problem if you had a very overconfident person who always said, yes, I could see what it was. You could do very badly. And what is interesting is that people automatically largely adjust themselves to deal with this problem. So if you start with an overconfident and an underconfident person, after they've been working together, they will actually adjust. So the overconfident will become less confident and the underconfident will be more confident, because it's only if they can match it in this way that they can get the advantage of working together. And luckily, this seems to happen. But the whole thing falls to pieces if the two people working together, one of them is much less competent than the other, because we have this tendency to give too much weight to other people, even when we shouldn't.
Great answer. Now we've got a great follow-up question actually here. This might be one for you, Uta, which is how is working together in this way affected if the people involved are autistic, neurodiverse? Is there any research on this?
Well, as we have previously, autism studies have shown that there might, in many of them, be a problem in mentalizing, that is, trying to think what the other person is thinking. And as we have increasingly, I think, become aware, it's this can lead to overthinking, is bad for cooperation. So being autistic should be no hindrance at all, possibly even an advantage at cooperation. It would, however, be, if you're right, a disadvantage if you were in a competitive situation where you always have to try and outthink the next step that the other person might be doing. That can gain you an advantage in competition. But as we've seen in the O. Henry story with the two people, they were trying to outthink each other, and a very, very in a cooperative way, using their mentalizing ability. What would they wish? What would they like? That actually didn't work out too well.
Great, very nice question, Brina. Thank you very much for that. Next question is from Sean, and Alex has already touched on this a little bit, but it's about why are we so obsessed with reputation? Isn't it a crushing weight to bear? It seems that way, doesn't it?
Well, we do need trustworthy partners to work with. There are people who would like to do things to get away with, not contributing to the kitty, not pulling their weight, because we are in a way all wired to do something for as little cost and little effort as possible. So if we can see we can get away with things, we do it, and we're all like that. It is not the case that there are some people who are the typical so-called free riders, the ones who go on the train but they don't pay their fare. Everybody else pays their fare and they think that's fine. So this is a very important thing, not to let the free riders in us all to take over. We must do this by some means, and reputation is a means of, as it were, guaranteeing that you won't be one of those people. Even so, you have the opportunity to be a free rider. You feel, oh, if you were found out, that would be absolutely terrible. Of course, you can't be anonymous. If you are anonymous, then you can't be found out, and that is when free riders often really proliferate.
But having a good reputation does have direct advantages, so you may get rewarded by other people helping you if you've helped them. And also, if you have a bad reputation, you'll be punished because people won't work with you. So there are some direct effects as well.
Yeah, and they will ostracize you. Yeah. And so there is enough incentive to build a good reputation.
Great, that's a very nice question, Sean. Thank you very much. We move on to another anonymous question, and this one is for Alex, actually. So, Alex, what do you think presenting this kind of research in comic form adds, and what age groups would you recommend this book for? Good question.
Well, the second question is easier, I think. So we've written it in mind with, I guess, like a general adult audience. So we want it to be a popular science book. And so as such, it could be read by anyone, I would say kind of 12 plus, who's interested in sort of neuroscience. And it will, in bookshops, it will go in the kind of graphic novel section, because that's what it's kind of described as, and because it's quite a big book, it wouldn't fit. But in a way, it'd be nice if you could find it on the shelves next to sort of Richard Dawkins and Steve Pinker and Brian Cox and all that. But yeah, we have written it for adults, despite my background as a children's writer, and despite the ongoing kind of association that comics are for children. I mean, I would say that I think doing this as comics makes it more fun to read. if I'm not besmirching any of you who've kind of written prose and books about the same kind of thing. but I also think that it does open up the kind of work to a different audience. Like there are some people who actively choose to read comics, or people who might be put off by reading what might look like a kind of an academic book about neuroscience, might think, well, I can read a comic about it. So I'm kind of excited that it opens it up to sort of different readers. But really what I think it adds is it forces us who are kind of trying to communicate our ideas to other people to do it more slowly and carefully. So as I was sort of saying earlier, I kind of wrote a script in which I kind of had to try and unpick the sort of steps involved in the research, and then think of ways to break that down so that we could add pictures to it, so that you could kind of clearly kind of say, this is the idea, this is how we did it, and this is the sort of the understanding that follows, or what we now think we have a better idea of. And I think comics does that exceptionally well. And of course, prose and I guess poetry and filmmaking can do these things too. But I think there's something kind of magical about comics that can kind of cut through some of the ideas really quickly, and also slow some down so that you really take it in.
Great, thank you very much, Alex. Uta, Chris, do you have anything to add to that in terms of the presentation? Very unique sort of style of presenting things. I've not seen anything like this before. I found it fascinating to read.
Well, I guess I was always struck by the fact that if you have very few illustrations when you write a sort of academic type book, usually because the publishers don't like it. Whereas if you give a talk at a conference, you're going to have innumerable pictures, and the way you present your data is usually in pictures. So it seemed to me that actually comics are closer to the way we present things at meetings than they are to the way we present things in books.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think there was something very nice about the creation of the book, in that we had to clarify our ideas to communicate them to Alex and also to Dan, and it came back, and it was quite suddenly, clear to us that we didn't
understand it at all.
Yeah, we didn't really, we weren't clear because we couldn't be clear. And I think that has been a very, very valuable exercise for us.
Fantastic. So next question is from Emma, and it's sort of a developmental question, I think, and it's about, is the pattern of behaviour seen during the experimental trust honesty games, presumably done in adults, different from when they're performed with children or adolescents? So do we find some sort of developmental change in terms of the way in which people do these trust and honesty games?
The very young children, of course, have no option but to trust the adults. That's how development starts up. But they are very, very sensitive to having a reliable informant versus an unreliable informant. And they go very much, I think, with the familiar, that's the more trustworthy person. Things are very interesting in the age 6 to 8 group, where at age 8.
No, they start off, if you play the sort of trust type games, they're not quite the same, but the very young children tend to keep it all for themselves. Yeah. And then they start sharing it more and more and more. But at the same time as they're sharing it more and more with their in-group, they're sharing it less and less with their out-group. So this parochialism increases as you get older.
Yeah, so they have an understanding of fairness, but it's very strongly confined to their in-group. And so it's always, depending, of course, on the context. But there are developmental changes that occur, which are very interesting.
Great, that's very, very interesting. So there clearly is some developmental changes that go through life. Thank you, Emma, for that question. Just a reminder, if you've got any questions, please tap them into the Q&A. You've got some experts here in pretty much anything, probably even things that haven't been presented. The book's huge and there's loads of stuff in there. So test them out, guys, if you want to ask some questions on things you want to know about the brain. So next one, Tamkins asked the question, how our brain reacts when we go through trauma, and how is the level of our confidence? So I guess if the brain is damaged, does that affect our confidence and level of confidence?
Yes, I mean, obviously it critically depends on where the damage is. So if you have damage, you probably know more about this than me. If you have damage to the visual system or the sensory system, you become much less confident in what you're seeing, and probably rightly so. But if you have damage to the front of the brain, which is actually where the confidence probably gets computed, you can actually become very bad at assessing how confident you should be, because there's something which we call, metacognitive accuracy, which basically means you should be confident when the answer you give is going to be right, and less confident when the answer you give is likely to be wrong. And this relationship is largely reduced if you get frontal lobe damage. So you're unable to assess your confidence. Whereas if you have sensory damage, you know that you should not be confident. So that's one effect of brain damage.
Mm-hmm. And presumably the confidence will affect decision making of the sort of things that you've been talking about as well.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Mm.
Right.
Is that with I assume that when I see the word trauma, I tend to think of emotional trauma rather than physical trauma. But is that would the answer be roughly the same?
It depends, I think, is the answer. If we are talking here about possibly, there is a big separation between what we call competence, ability to do a certain task, and the way you perceive this ability. And that could, of course, be disturbed by some emotional trauma. And it could be like you go towards the overconfident or the underconfident side, and both are not very good.
Yeah. But we make this distinction between accuracy of confidence and bias of confidence. So you could be overconfident. So you would always say, you could vary in how confident you were, but you would always be pretty confident that the difference between the good and bad decisions could still be there, but at this upper end of the confidence scale, and you could have, or confidence could be lowered. So you could have, I would somehow predict that with emotional trauma, it would affect your confidence bias and not your confidence accuracy.
But just to clarify, I think
this is a pure speculation. Yeah.
The word confidence is used differently by different people. So you can describe it as a sort of steady personality attribute. There's a confident personality and there's a not confident personality. But what we've mainly been talking about is these sort of fluctuations that any personality has. So they might always be at a high level, but they equally, can indicate fluctuations depending on how good they are at something. And we're talking about the same word, but it actually means, psychologically speaking, quite different things.
But if I could just put in a sort of, one problem is that if you become very competent in one area, like winning a Nobel Prize, you believe that you're competent in all areas and can explain consciousness or whatever it may be.
Very dangerous.
Very good. I get the joke. There we go. So there's another question, very interesting one, because you talked about differences in the way people do research or perform in terms of their reputation under time pressure. But there's a question: has there been any research about cooperation under time pressure? Does this negatively affect cooperation as we might expect? I don't know if anyone's done anything like that.
I think it would badly affect.
Yes, one feature of cooperation is the idea that it's a very good thing to argue, and the mere fact of if somebody gives an answer and then person says no, that must be wrong, and then thinks about it a bit and says no, this is why it's wrong. Obviously, if you did that under pressure, you would lose this advantage of being able to argue amongst yourselves about what was really happening. But this is off the top of my head. I don't know.
No, I think people probably considered it too obvious to have to research.
Great. Okay. Well, you see, some of these questions are really drawing out, sort of holes in our knowledge, which is terrific, and I think is really part of the whole idea here to get you thinking about things as well.
Yeah.
So we've got another question here, another anonymous one about neuroimaging. So could Chris perhaps tell us a little bit more about the neuroimaging side of things? How does good cooperation look in our brains? Can you physically see anything happening in the brain when we're cooperating well?
This is of great interest, and I think it's very early days, because one thing is that to do that, you would really want to have two people in the scanner simultaneously. or at least in scanners at the same time. This is quite difficult and expensive. I believe there is a two-head scanner, but it hasn't actually been used yet, as far as I know. And then you have the problem of how you actually analyze the data. But there is quite interesting work showing that if you scan someone watching a film, they tend to show similar patterns in relation to what's happening in the film. And the more similar they are, the more similar their descriptions of what the film will be, and the more easy it will be for one to describe the film to the other. So there is some evidence of this sort of alignment, as we call it, which you can pick up in the brain imaging data.
A synchrony is often observed in brain activity using not MRI, but EEG or MEG measurements. But again, synchrony is not always considered to be like the be all and end all of cooperation, because very often you have to do a complementary things, not the same things. And that is all quite tricky.
That's wide open to how you would actually look at that in the brain scanner. And I think that's what's going to be happening in the next few years.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that question. Now we've got a question from Deborah here, who, looking at cross-cultural things, is a very interesting one. Do you think the importance of reputation you've talked about might be bound to Western cultures, since things like self-enhancement seem to be more prevalent in individualist over collectivist cultures? Is there much research on cooperative behaviors in other cultures?
We did one experiment where we compared people in Denmark, Iran, and China. And the idea was that in Denmark, people tend to trust each other. In China, they do a bit. In Iran, they hardly do at all. I exaggerate slightly. And the question was, if they did this joint decision-making task, would it may be that it's in Denmark where you take account of the not so competent person when you shouldn't, whereas perhaps in Iran they would be happily ignoring them. This didn't happen. They were all behaved in exactly the same way and gave too much weight to incompetent people. So that aspect we didn't find. But I think the thing about reputation is it's a question about reputation for what. And I think certain things that give you a good reputation in individualist societies might not give you a good reputation in collectivist societies, and it would be something else that would give you a good reputation there. But I would predict that the reputation itself would be equally powerful.
Yeah.
I mean, there's one quite interesting experiment where they compared individualistic and collectivist cultures, that is basically Chinese and American, and they gave them some task where it's an advantage to be individualistic or collectivist. And then they showed when the Americans were trying to be collectivist, they had to activate their frontal lobes. And when the Chinese were trying to be individualist, they had to activate their frontal lobes. So again, it's this top-down control depending on what the context is.
Great, thank you very much. We've got a few more questions. Well, I'm probably not going to finish all the questions for the end, but I'll see if we can get through quite a few before we finish. So another anonymous one, you mentioned that kindness is intuitive, but we're also looking to maintain a good reputation for ourselves. Thinking about introspection, is there a way to know if our intentions are motivated by reputation or merely goodwill? Do you think that having different motivations would have a perceptible impact on our actions? Cool, there's quite a lot in there.
Yeah, I'm trying here just to say that we probably didn't emphasize enough that this business about valuing our reputation is not very conscious. I think it is conscious in the reputation management world and in the internet, but normally in our day-to-day activities, we just do this completely automatically. If we think about it, it becomes immediately a bit fake. You know, if we do things for the sake of having a better image than we should have, that's not very good. It is actually quite interesting that much of this behavior that we do show when we know we are observed by others, as opposed to anonymous, is completely automatic and spontaneous. We don't have to deliberate about it. So to that extent, it's quite intuitive, exactly. But it need not be. As I said, we have the means of doing this professionally, as it were. Hire somebody to manage our reputation. I mean, that is so fake. That is just nothing to do with this sort of basic idea of how we want to be regarded by others. But it was before Adam Smith hit on this idea of the importance of reputation. It wasn't very often mentioned. Particularly in antiquity, it was fame that was supposed to motivate your deed, on honor. Yeah. So these things are quite related, but they are not meant to be kind of done knowingly, but done intuitively.
But I should add that introspection is very difficult, and I don't know that we talk about it much in this book, but we believe that you have to learn how to do it, and particularly you learn from other people and from your culture. So there may be ways of picking up these differences, but we probably haven't discovered how to do it yet.
Great. Okay, so David's asked a question which I think has sort of been answered already about the physical data, the brain activity data, and so on. And it was the relationship with observational data, behavioral data, I'm guessing. But I think one of the things that really characterized the work that Chris and Uta do is that it involves all sorts of different paradigms, behavioral testing, neuroimaging, and that's this multidisciplinary approach that they take to things. So thanks for that question, David, who also says thanks for a great talk. Chloe asked a question is about innateness of reputation. Is it an innate drive? And just to follow up on that, Marcella asked another question about, do we find this in young children? How to talk about reputation with young kids? So as we can see, if we can address both of those questions.
Yes, there are some studies, but very few, I think, really to talk about this properly. But it does seem that even young infants before 1 year of age smile differently if there is an audience for them. I mean, this is sort of there are studies about this so-called audience effect. That is, we behave differently when we think we are being watched. Yeah, it's surprising that this should be effective in very young children.
And also in fish.
Yes.
Great answer. Okay, we've got one last question. I'm just going to try and fit this in because this is probably pretty pertinent for all families who are going through having children going through GCSEs or A levels at the moment, and it's about whether brains are can be better tuned to humanities or to science, or is there any research into the differences between whether people tend to choose sciences or humanities? I know there's a lot in the book about your background, Uta, and the switch from sort of humanities to science, which I found really fascinating. So if there's any research on that.
Yeah, from my personal point of view, it's all open. You could go by luck one way or another way. You can call it luck or random chance. I don't know. I know there are people who say they knew from age 4 that they wanted to be scientists. But
I think the differences between sciences as actually practiced and humanities as actually practiced are much less than people think. And in part this is because of the funny way that science is taught and the way that the humanities are taught.
Yeah.
Fantastic. That's a fantastic way to finish things off.
It's the teacher that makes more difference than what's in your brain in the first place, I suspect.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Couldn't agree more. Great. Okay, well, that's absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much, everyone, for all those wonderful questions, and thank you very much to the speakers, to Chris, Uta, and Alex, for answering those questions so well, and for the wonderful presentation. If you would like to purchase a copy of Two Heads: How Our Brains Work with Each Other, with Other Brains, I fully recommend it. I've just finished reading it. This will be available from our partner bookseller, Fox Lane Books. More information on book sales, please visit the festival website or head direct to foxlanebooks.co.uk/Festival of Ideas. So we very much hope that you'll continue to be engaged with the York Festival ideas. Check out the website for full details of all the events on the festival programme. We'd love to hear your ideas on these events and continue the conversations using the hashtag York Ideas. Final big thanks to Chris, Uta and Alex.